Margaret Ellison had spent 35 years in her small cottage tucked away in the outskirts of Springfield. It wasn't a grand home, far from it. It was a modest house, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, with walls that creaked and windows that rattled in the winter wind. The paint had long since peeled away, and the roof, though sturdy, leaked during heavy rains. Yet, despite its faults and flaws, it was her sanctuary, a place filled with memories of a life once lived, of days gone by, some full of joy, and others marked by sorrow. She had inherited the cottage from her parents, who had built it with their own hands back in the 1950s. Her father, a kind-hearted man, was a farmer who worked the land until his hands bled, while her mother, a soft-spoken woman, kept the house in order. The two of them had instilled in Margaret a deep appreciation for simple things that money couldn't buy. They had never been wealthy, but they had each other, and that was all that mattered. Her father had always said, "You don't need much to be happy, Margaret, just enough to get by, and the love of those you hold dear." Her childhood had been one of love and laughter, despite the financial struggles that had always seemed to loom over them. But when Margaret turned 39, the world she had known came crashing down. Her husband, Charles, whom she had married right out of high school, had died suddenly of a heart attack. He had been only 45, a seemingly healthy man who had worked as an accountant in a local firm. The loss devastated Margaret. She had never expected to lose him so young, and certainly not in such an abrupt, cruel manner. Left alone to raise their only son, Jacob, Margaret found herself in a world that seemed to offer no respite. There were no more family dinners, no more spontaneous trips to the lake on weekends, no more lazy evenings spent watching television together. It was just her and Jacob. But she knew she had to stay strong. For him, she threw herself into her work, taking up part-time jobs wherever she could find them, just to keep the bills paid and the lights on. For a while, she didn't even notice how much she was sacrificing. It became routine: wake up, go to work, come home, cook dinner, take care of Jacob, and then sleep, only to repeat the cycle again the next day. But as time passed, the weight of everything began to take its toll. The house grew quieter, the rooms more empty. Despite the hardships, Margaret remained resolute in her belief that her son deserved a better life. She did everything she could to ensure that Jacob had the opportunities she had never been able to afford. She pushed him to work hard at school, to aim higher than she ever had, and when he graduated from college, she was bursting with pride. Even though the reality of his departure left her with an aching emptiness she didn't know how to fill. Jacob had always been the bright light in her life, and now that he was gone, she found herself alone, trying to adjust to a world that seemed to be moving faster than she could keep up. A few years later, Veronica Hartley moved into the building next door, a newly constructed apartment complex called Hartley Heights. It stood tall, shining with a kind of sleek, modern elegance that Margaret couldn't help but notice every time she stepped outside. Veronica Hartley was a woman who had everything Margaret didn't: youth, beauty, wealth, and power. She had married well, to a successful businessman who had recently passed away, leaving her with more money than she could possibly spend in a lifetime. Veronica, it seemed, had everything, and she never failed to let Margaret know it. The first time Margaret encountered Veronica was one summer afternoon when she was returning from the market. She had a cloth bag in hand, filled with a few vegetables and cans of soup. Her shoes were worn, the soles thinned from years of walking the same dusty roads. She was tired, but as always, she kept a steady pace. It was then that Veronica, who was sitting on her balcony, caught sight of her. With a sharp laugh, Veronica called down to her. "Oh, Margaret," she called, her voice dripping with mockery. "Still living in that shoebox of a house? I see. Really should consider upgrading your lifestyle. It must be so charming to live in such a quaint little dump." Margaret didn't look up. She knew better than to engage in such petty banter, but it still stung. Veronica's words weren't new, and they weren't the first time she had been made to feel small. It had been like this for as long as Margaret could remember. People always found a way to remind her of what she didn't have, and Veronica Hartley seemed to take special pleasure in pointing out the differences between their lives. As though Margaret's modesty was something to be ridiculed. With a forced smile, Margaret quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a hot rush of humiliation crawl up her neck, but she refused to let it show. She would not let Veronica's taunts defeat her. She had faced much worse in her life, and yet, for some reason, this moment hurt more than the others. Perhaps it was because Veronica's laughter was a reminder of everything Margaret had never been able to have: luxury, ease, and comfort. Asterisk. As she reached the door to her cottage, Margaret stopped for a moment, staring at the peeling paint and the overgrown garden. The house that had once been full of love and laughter now felt cold, like a shell of its former self. It had become a symbol of everything she had lost and everything she had never been able to achieve. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed, or when she had felt truly happy in this place. Asterisk. She entered the house, setting the bag of groceries down on the kitchen counter. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn to keep the heat of the summer sun at bay. Margaret took a deep breath and sank into the old rocking chair by the window. Outside, she could hear the sound of children playing in the street, their laughter echoing in the warm air. For a moment, she let herself imagine a different life, a life where she wasn't defined by her circumstances, where she wasn't reminded every day of what she didn't have. Asterisk. But then, the image of Veronica's smirking face flashed in her mind, and the fantasy shattered. Margaret stood up abruptly, feeling a spark of anger deep inside her. She walked across the room to the small desk in the corner, where a dusty box sat with a few of her late husband's things inside. The box held his patents, ideas he had never been able to fully pursue in his lifetime. She had never thought much about them before, but today, something was different. Asterisk. She opened the box and took out a stack of papers. Each one was a blueprint for an invention, a device or mechanism designed to solve a problem or make life easier. Margaret's fingers traced the faded ink, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose. These ideas, these inventions, they could change everything. They could change her life. Asterisk. The spark of anger turned into something else, a determination, a desire to prove herself, to prove to Veronica and everyone else who had ever looked down on her that she wasn't just some old woman in a rundown house. She had a legacy. She had something worth fighting for. Asterisk. And that night, Margaret made a decision that would change her life forever. She would take these inventions, these ideas that her husband had left behind, and make something of them. She would build a future for herself, and she would do it on her terms. Asterisk. Little did she know, that decision would lead her down a path that would not only reshape her own destiny, but also alter the lives of everyone around her, including the woman who had once mocked her small house. Asterisk. Margaret sat in her dimly lit living room long after the sun had set, the only light coming from the lamp above her husband's old desk. The box of patents lay open before her, its contents spread across the worn mahogany surface like fragments of a forgotten dream. It had been over 2 decades since Charles had passed away, but somehow, in this moment, she could feel him in the room. She could almost hear his voice explaining each sketch, each diagram, with that gentle enthusiasm that once filled their nights with long conversations and endless possibility. Asterisk. She remembered how passionate Charles had been about solving everyday problems. While others invested in stocks or properties, he invested in ideas. He was obsessed with efficiency, sustainability, and affordability. His dream had always been to create something meaningful, something that would help ordinary people live better lives. But life hadn't given them the luxury to pursue those dreams. Money was tight. Raising Jacob took priority. Every time Charles had come close to launching a product, something had pulled them back. Hospital bills, mortgage payments, school fees. Eventually, his designs had been stored away, labeled as someday. That someday never came, until now. Asterisk. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up one of the designs labeled H2O, Pure Portable Water Purifier. She remembered this one vividly. Charles had drawn it after a trip to a rural village with a church group. They had seen children drinking from murky streams, mothers walking miles just to fetch buckets of water. When he returned, Charles had said, "Clean water shouldn't be a luxury, Maggie. It should be a right." That night, he stayed up until morning working on a design for a device that could filter water using inexpensive components powered by solar energy. Asterisk. She studied the blueprint again. Even to her untrained eyes, it looked promising. What if she could bring this to life? What if this could be the start of something more than just a quiet retirement? She wasn't an engineer. She wasn't a businesswoman. But she was determined, and somewhere inside her, The embers of her younger self, the girl who used to believe she could conquer the world, were still glowing. The next morning, Margaret took a deep breath and dialed the number of a local technology incubator she had read about months ago. It catered to startups and inventors, helping them bring ideas to market. She never thought she would need such a place, but now she had something to fight for. The receptionist on the other end was polite but cautious when Margaret explained. She was a senior citizen hoping to develop a water purification device. Still, they gave her an appointment to speak with one of their advisors. 2 days later, Margaret stepped into the sleek, glass-fronted building downtown. She wore her best cardigan and sensible shoes. Clutching a file folder with her husband's patents, she felt out of place among the young men and women in jeans and earbuds, tapping away at laptops or chatting in buzzword-laden lingo. But she kept her head high. She was not here to impress with tech saviness. She was here to find someone who could see value where others saw wrinkles and gray hair. After waiting nervously in the lounge for almost an hour, she was finally called into a small conference room. A young woman in her early 30s entered, introducing herself as Isla Reyes, an innovation coach. Isla had the kind of energy that lit up a room. Short cropped hair, a firm handshake, and a disarming smile that immediately made Margaret feel less like a relic. They spoke for over an hour. Margaret explained her husband's vision, showed Isla the blueprints, and talked about the inspiration behind the idea. Isla asked thoughtful questions not just about the device, but about Margaret herself. She seemed intrigued, not only by the practicality of the design, but by the story that came with it. Margaret was surprised at how emotional she became, sharing not just the technical details but the memories. How Charles had drawn these sketches at their kitchen table, how he had once tried to build a prototype using leftover parts from an old coffee maker. When Margaret finally fell silent, Isla looked at her for a long moment and then said, "You know, you've got more than a product here. You've got a story. People invest in stories." That was the moment it began. Within a week, Isla had arranged for a small grant from the incubator to begin building a prototype. She helped Margaret assemble a team, a couple of engineering students, a retired chemist, and a business student who volunteered to help with market research. They worked in a shared lab space with access to 3D printers, tools, and mentorship. Margaret went in every day, sometimes just to watch and learn, sometimes to brew tea for the team, but always to be part of it. She was no longer just the widow who lived in a small cottage. She was the founder of a budding social impact startup. They named it AquaTrue Legacy. The name was Isla's idea, honoring Charles's original vision and Margaret's decision to carry it forward. Within months, they had a working prototype and a small network of local nonprofits interested in distributing it to underserved communities. Word spread quickly. A local news channel picked up the story of the senior inventor reviving her husband's dream. That story was picked up by a national media outlet, and soon Margaret was being invited to speak at conferences and events. Every time she took the stage, people were struck not only by the product, but by her quiet strength, her authenticity, and the depth of purpose that fueled her mission. She used every bit of profit to reinvest in the company. No luxury cars, no mansion. Her cottage remained the same, though she did get the roof fixed and planted a new row of lavender along the fence. She didn't want to change who she was, just to do more, help more. Meanwhile, Veronica Hartley remained blissfully unaware. Her apartment complex continued to thrive for now. She still held her brunches and parties, still made loud comments about Margaret's quaint little dwelling, still treated her as the poor neighbor who didn't belong. But things were changing. One afternoon, as Margaret was walking to the post office, she overheard two of the younger residents from Hartley Heights whispering, "That's her." One of them said, "The water filter lady, she's on Instagram now. My friend's dad works for one of the companies that's trying to partner with her." Seriously? The other asked. "She lives in that house." Margaret smiled to herself. People were starting to notice. Around this time, Isla arranged for a major meeting with a regional government official who oversaw environmental health initiatives. The meeting went so well that AquaTrue Legacy was awarded a pilot project in 3 counties. It was a major step, one that would open doors to long-term contracts and serious investments. But it also meant Margaret needed to think strategically. She needed to expand operations, set up a supply chain, maybe even acquire property for warehousing or distribution. That's when fate intervened. One of Isla's contacts informed them that a property was going into a foreclosure auction, property that had commercial zoning, residential units, and an established location. When Margaret saw the address, she froze. It was Hartley Heights. At first she couldn't believe it, but after making a few quiet inquiries, the story came together. Veronica's son had taken over some of the management responsibilities after her husband's death. He had mismanaged the finances, borrowed heavily against the equity of the building, and used it to fund his gambling addiction. The debts had mounted, and now the bank was seizing the property. The auction was set for the following month. Margaret said nothing to anyone, not even Isla. She simply smiled, thanked her contact, and asked for the details. She registered for the auction using a newly created holding company, Il is Son Holdings L for Ellison's son for Jacob. On the day of the auction, she dressed in a simple blue shawl, just as she always had, and quietly placed her bid. There were others in the room, but none of them expected the silver-haired woman with soft eyes and a steel resolve to win, but she did, with one signature. Margaret became the new owner of Hartley Heights. Asterisk, no press release, no celebration, no parade. Asterisk, she went home that night, sat in her kitchen, brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea, and smiled, not with smugness or triumph, but with quiet satisfaction. Asterisk, the woman who had once been mocked for her shoebox home had just bought the building from which she had been ridiculed, and it was only the beginning. Margaret's days changed rapidly after the acquisition of Hartley Heights, though not in the way many might have imagined. There were no lavish vacations, no red carpets, no sudden makeover montages like in movies. Margaret still woke up at 6 in the morning, still made tea with a teaspoon of honey, still watered her roses in the front yard of her now modestly renovated cottage, but inside her, something had shifted. She was no longer just living, she was leading, and she wasn't doing it alone. Asterisk, the world she had quietly entered was one filled with urgency, innovation, and complexity. But even amidst all the startup noise, Margaret remained steady. She had one foot grounded in the principles she was raised with: honesty, humility, hard work, and the other, reaching forward into a space of technology and transformation. Her partnership with Isla had evolved from a mentor-mentee relationship into a dynamic co-leadership. Isla, who was navigating her own struggles as a woman of color in a male-dominated tech world, found a rare strength in Margaret's unwavering faith, not just in their product, but in their mission. Asterisk, their team had expanded to 15 people, each one committed to scaling AquaTrue Legacy's reach. There were engineers fine-tuning the design of the water purifier, data analysts studying usage patterns across rural deployments, and marketing strategists trying to position the product not just as a necessity but as a symbol of social change. Their tagline had become, "Clean water, dignified futures." Asterisk, but no matter how big the team got, Margaret insisted on knowing each of their names. She brought cookies on Fridays, remembered birthdays, and wrote hand-signed notes of appreciation. That was the kind of leader she had become. Not loud, not commanding, but powerful in her humanity. Asterisk, when the transfer papers for Hartley Heights were finalized, Margaret was briefed on the state of the property. The building was functional but suffering from years of negligent management. Elevators broke down frequently, plumbing issues were routine, and some tenants were behind on rent. Veronica Hartley, still living in the penthouse suite, had not paid rent in over 3 months. Legally, she now owed money to Margaret. Asterisk, but Margaret wasn't thinking about money. She was thinking about transformation. Asterisk, she decided to visit the complex herself, not as a landlord throwing her weight around, but as a woman who wanted to restore dignity to a place that had once symbolized arrogance. The building's doorman, a young man named Devon, looked startled when she walked in, unannounced. Asterisk, excuse me ma'am, can I help you? He asked politely. Asterisk, Margaret smiled. Yes, you already are. I'm the new owner. Asterisk, Devon blinked. You own Hartley Heights. Asterisk, she nodded and handed him a letter. It introduced her as the CEO of L & Son Holdings and outlined her plans to conduct a building-wide inspection and community meet and greet the following week. Asterisk, Devon's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing more. He opened the door for her as she stepped into the lobby. A place that once seemed intimidating now felt like just another opportunity. Asterisk, she walked the halls slowly, noting peeling wallpaper, scuffed floors, and flickering lights. She didn't judge, she observed. She passed by a young couple arguing quietly in front of their door. A tired mother trying to juggle 2 children and a bag of groceries. An elderly man sitting alone on the bench near the stairwell. These were the people who lived behind the walls Veronica used to boast about. Real people, working people, struggling people, people just like she had once been. Later that week, Margaret hosted the meet and greet in what used to be the gym, an underused space filled with outdated machines and broken light fixtures. With Isla's help, she brought in folding chairs, refreshments, and a projector screen. She didn't advertise it with flashy flyers or banners. She sent a handwritten note to each tenant inviting them to join her for tea, snacks, and a conversation. To her surprise, over 40 residents showed up. They came out of curiosity, mostly. Some were skeptical, some were confused. A few even thought it might be a joke. But when Margaret stood before them in her navy cardigan, hands folded gently, eyes warm but firm, they listened. She began with a story about her late husband, about True legacy, and about how this very building had once been used to mock her. She spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity. Then she transitioned into her plans, renovating common areas, installing solar panels to reduce electricity costs, introducing a 24/7 on-call maintenance system, and creating a tenant support desk for legal and housing aid. There was silence when she finished. Then, a slow clap began. It was Devon. Then others joined in. Soon, the room erupted into applause, not wild, but respectful, appreciative. Margaret smiled gently. I'm not here to be a landlord, she said. I'm here to be a neighbor who listens. It was the start of something entirely new for Hartley Heights. Meanwhile, Veronica was unraveling. She had ignored the letters. She had dismissed the rumors. She had assumed that the new owner would never come around, and if they did, she could charm or manipulate them like she always had. But when she finally confronted the truth that Margaret, the woman she had mocked and belittled for years, was now her landlord, something in her cracked. She showed up at the lobby office 3 days after the meet and greet, her heels clicking furiously on the marble floor. Her face was a storm cloud of disbelief and fury. Margaret, reviewing renovation bids with Isla, looked up calmly. Well, she said softly, I see the wind carried you in. Veronica's voice was icy. You can't possibly think you're qualified to run this building. I own it, Margaret replied, folding her papers neatly. That's qualification enough. Veronica slammed her handbag on the desk. You're nothing but a charity case. You've always been beneath this building. Isla stepped forward. Ma'am, I'd advise you to lower your voice. But Margaret raised a hand. It's all right, Isla. She turned back to Veronica, her tone even and clear. I understand you're behind on your rent. You'll receive a formal notice next week. If you need support, we've established a tenant advocacy desk downstairs. You may speak with them. You wouldn't dare evict me, Veronica hissed. I would dare to treat you exactly like everyone else, Margaret replied, because fairness is not revenge, it's justice. Veronica left that day trembling with humiliation. For the first time in her life, she had no power in a room she used to own. Over the next few months, Margaret and Isla worked diligently to upgrade Hartley Heights. The name was removed from the front signage, replaced temporarily with a simple wooden plaque. The building's color scheme was softened, the playground repaired, and an unused common area was transformed into a learning hub for after-school tutoring. Margaret hired local teens to work part-time doing community tasks, trash pickup, deliveries, childcare. Suddenly, the building felt different. The tenants noticed. One day, a single mother named Shauna came to Margaret's office, with tears in her eyes. No one's ever done anything for us before, she whispered. Not like this. Margaret reached out and took her hand. It's not about charity. It's about restoring what should have always been here, dignity. As news of Hartley Heights' transformation spread, local reporters began showing up, curious about the story. Margaret agreed to one interview, where she famously said, I didn't buy a building. I reclaimed a narrative. The article went viral. It wasn't long before more doors opened. Investors approached True Legacy with offers to expand. Cities wanted to replicate the community housing model Margaret had initiated. Suddenly, the woman in the blue cardigan had become a figure of social innovation. But even then, Margaret declined most offers that didn't align with her vision. Growth without integrity is just noise, she told Isla. Together, they established a non-profit arm focusing on providing clean water systems in senior living homes and underfunded neighborhoods. Each new partnership was another piece of Charles's legacy reborn. On the 1-year anniversary of the acquisition, Margaret stood on the roof of the building, now fully renovated and renamed Ellison Commons. She looked out over the city, her hair caught in the wind, her eyes moist but proud. A group of children were playing in the courtyard below, chasing bubbles. The benches were full of people reading, laughing, living. Isla joined her, handing her a small gift, a framed photo of the original water purifier prototype. He'd be proud, Isla said. Margaret nodded. He is. I feel him every time someone turns on clean water, every time a mother feels safe in her home. There was no celebration that day. No fireworks, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been built, not just a building, but a new way of believing in what age, grief, and determination could do. Margaret had returned, not just with vengeance, but with vision, and it was only the 3rd chapter in the story of a woman who had once been laughed at for her small house, and now stood tall over a community she had rebuilt with grace. Margaret's decision to remain silent about her ownership of the building until the legal documentation was final was not a matter of secrecy, it was a matter of strategy. She believed that timing was everything. She had learned over the course of her long and often painful life that reacting in haste never bore lasting fruit. The days following the acquisition of Hartley Heights were filled with careful, intentional steps. Margaret wasn't driven by the thrill of power or wealth. She was driven by the belief that redemption should never come wrapped in cruelty, but in accountability, truth, and transformation. The official papers arrived at her home in a thick, cream-colored envelope. She sat at her kitchen table, hands trembling slightly as she peeled it open and pulled out the deed. Her name, Margaret, and Ellison printed in bold at the top, followed by the words, rightful owner of the property located at 71 St. James Road, formerly Hartley Heights Apartments. For a moment, she didn't breathe. She simply stared at the words that solidified something deeply poetic. She, the woman who had been humiliated on that very soil, was now the legal proprietor of it, not through manipulation or inheritance, but through resilience, wisdom, and sheer determination. She placed the papers inside a clear folder and added it to the expanding file marked Legacy. She then reached for her notebook and penned a list titled, Day 1 Priorities for Hartley Heights. The list was practical review maintenance contracts, meet with legal advisors about delinquent tenants, inspect safety codes, but tucked between those notes were items of deeper intent. Meet residents, hear their stories, make them feel safe again. Margaret understood that bricks and mortar weren't the soul of a building. People were. The following Monday, she stepped into the newly vacated management office at the front of the building. It was dusty and disorganized, still bearing the signs of Veronica's inefficient administration. Folders were misfiled, contracts unsigned, notices stacked unopened. Margaret rolled up her sleeves and began sorting. Isla joined her by midday with coffees and lunch packed in compostable boxes. The two women sat at the floor, eating between stacks of tenant files and renovation quotes. This building's bones are strong, Isla said, glancing around, but its heart has been ignored. Margaret nodded. We'll change that. She worked tirelessly over the next 2 weeks, meeting with city inspectors, hiring a new maintenance crew, even repainting the office herself. Slowly, the space transformed into a calm and welcoming environment. She added potted plants, a suggestion box, and a shelf filled with second-hand books free for residents to borrow. A small handwritten sign on the door now read, Tenant Support and Community Office open daily. Tea, always available. It was around this time that Veronica received her official eviction notice. The document was delivered to her penthouse unit by a neutral process server, as required by law. Veronica, still oblivious to who owned the building, assumed it was an anonymous real estate firm. She was furious. Her face, once carefully maintained with layers of expensive creams and subtle injections, now showed cracks of real stress. Her son had abandoned her financial mess and flown to Costa Rica. Her savings had dried up, and now, the walls she had used to separate herself from the world, these luxurious, towering walls were caving in. She came storming into the new office that very afternoon, wearing oversized sunglasses and a scowl. She pushed open the glass door with theatrical force, expecting to find some low-level assistant to intimidate. Instead, she found Margaret seated calmly behind the desk, reading a tenant report. For a moment, Veronica stood frozen. Margaret looked up and removed her glasses. "Veronica," she said gently, "I've been expecting you." The color drained from Veronica's face. "You," she gasped. This is a joke. No, Margaret replied, closing the folder. "This is a fact. You bought the building." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I did," Margaret said, "and I intend to fix what's been broken here for far too long." Veronica staggered back a step and grabbed the edge of the desk for balance. "You planned this, you waited to humiliate me." "No," Margaret said, her voice steady. "I waited until I was strong enough not to." There was a long silence between them. Veronica sat down in the chair opposite Margaret without being invited. For the first time in her life, the older woman didn't look like the social queen she had once been. Her expensive blouse was wrinkled. Her hair, though still styled, had lost its shine. She looked tired, older than Margaret had ever remembered her looking. "You're evicting me," Veronica whispered. "I'm holding you to the same standards as every other tenant," Margaret replied. "You've missed 3 months of rent. There are legal options available to you, but the building can no longer carry losses under special privilege." "I have nowhere else to go." "There's a community housing program I fund through our foundation," Margaret said. "I can connect you with them." Veronica's face crumbled. "You don't even hate me, do you?" Margaret looked at her, her eyes softening. "I don't need to. That's the difference between us. I don't measure my worth in someone else's defeat." Veronica left the office silently. There were no more insults, no sarcastic barbs, only the sound of the glass door shutting quietly behind her. From that moment forward, she kept to herself, a ghost in the building she once ruled. With Veronica out of the way, Margaret began transforming the building in earnest. She met every tenant one by one. She walked the halls daily, knocking on doors, listening to their concerns. Some were initially wary of her. They had grown accustomed to being ignored or manipulated, but her patience, warmth, and follow-through began to win their trust. Leaky faucets were fixed. Elevators were repaired. The courtyard was cleared and replanted. Murals were commissioned from local artists, and the children's play area was redesigned with soft flooring and bright colors. Each Saturday, Margaret hosted what she called Commons Conversations. Residents gathered in the community room to discuss building issues, share stories, and plan social events. It became the heart of Ellison Commons, where birthdays were celebrated and lives intertwined. One day, a teenage girl named Kira stood up during a meeting and said, "This building used to feel like a prison. Now it feels like a neighborhood." Her mother wiped tears from her eyes as the room applauded. Margaret couldn't help but smile. This was the legacy she wanted. Not power, not revenge, but belonging. Outside the building, the community began to take notice. Local news outlets covered the transformation, hailing it as a model of senior-led leadership and housing reform. Politicians requested meetings. NGOs sought partnerships. But Margaret chose carefully. She wasn't interested in scaling at the cost of values. She agreed to one particular collaboration, with a nonprofit focused on women over 50 re-entering the workforce. Together they opened a resource room on the ground floor, complete with job search assistance, resume coaching, and workshops on digital literacy. It was named the Second Act Center. One evening, Isla found Margaret standing outside the building, watching the new sign being installed. Ellison Commons, a community reimagined. You did it, Isla said softly. No, Margaret replied. We did, all of us. Every scar, every failure, every insult. We turned it into a foundation. She took a deep breath, her eyes lifting to the windows above where families now slept in comfort, where children laughed freely. I thought I was building a project, she whispered, but I was building peace. And in that moment, beneath the glow of the new sign, Margaret Ellison felt the full weight of her journey settle not as a burden, but as a blessing. Asterisk, the woman who had once been mocked for her small home was now the architect of something far greater, a living, breathing community carved from her resolve and compassion. Asterisk, and yet, even with all the progress, she knew this was not the final chapter. Asterisk, it was simply the turning point. The moment where pain no longer defined her. Asterisk, where laughter true, kind, and shared began to echo through every hallway. Asterisk, the days that followed Veronica's stunned exit from the office marked the beginning of a new rhythm for Ellison Commons. The change in the building's energy was subtle at first, like a room slowly filling with sunlight after years of being shuttered. Residents began to greet each other in hallways. Children played more freely in the reopened courtyard. An unspoken tension that had long lingered in the air, birthed from neglect, fear of eviction, and mismanagement, began to lift. And at the heart of that shift was Margaret, quietly redefining what ownership and leadership looked like. Asterisk, she didn't need a throne or a title. Her authority came from her actions, from the way she showed up every day, walking through the corridors with a clipboard in one hand and homemade muffins in the other. She took the time to sit with tenants who had complaints, not just listening, but taking notes, asking questions, and promising to follow up, and then actually doing it. Her consistency became its own kind of revolution. People weren't used to being seen, let alone heard. Margaret made them feel both. Asterisk, but amidst the growing respect and quiet admiration, Margaret faced one of her greatest tests, the issue of eviction. It wasn't just Veronica. A few other tenants had also been behind on rent for months, some due to unemployment, others due to sheer miscommunication during the turbulent change in ownership. Margaret had to draw the line between compassion and sustainability. Asterisk, so she set up a rent relief review committee made up of herself, Isla, and to resident volunteers. Mrs. Hartley, despite her tension with Margaret, was not among them. Instead, the committee heard each case and tried to find personalized solutions, structured payment plans, job referrals, connecting tenants to city resources, and in some cases, forgiving small amounts of back rent in exchange for volunteering within the building. Asterisk, through this process, Margaret learned more about her tenants than any set of files could ever reveal. There was Nora, a widowed schoolteacher with early-stage dementia, who simply forgot to pay. There was Tariq, a disabled veteran who had been too proud to ask for help. There was Maribel, a single mother working 2 jobs, who broke down in tears during her review session, admitting she had never missed a payment until her landlord changed and she lost track of how to pay. Asterisk, Margaret looked her in the eyes and said, "You've held this place together longer than I have. You don't owe me an apology." Asterisk, in every decision, Margaret aimed not for perfection, but for fairness, and in doing so, she rebuilt trust brick by metaphorical brick. Asterisk, but as the building flourished, Veronica's presence remained a lingering shadow on the top floor. She stayed largely hidden, avoiding eye contact, retreating further into the penthouse suite like a queen without a kingdom. The eviction notice had given her 60 days. That meant she had less than 2 months to find another place to live. Still, she made no move to leave, clinging to the crumbling illusion that somehow the situation would reverse, that Margaret would back down. Asterisk, Margaret, for her part, treated her no differently than anyone else. When maintenance requests came in from the penthouse, they were addressed. When community notices were posted, one was slid under Veronica's door like all the others. Margaret believed deeply that the dignity of others shouldn't depend on their behavior, should remain intact even when their power was gone. Asterisk, but Veronica did not respond to dignity. Her pride was an armor so thick that even kindness ricocheted off it, and as the eviction deadline approached, she became more erratic. Asterisk, one evening, Margaret returned to the office to find the door ajar. Nothing had been stolen, but several of her personal items were disturbed. A family photo frame tilted sideways, her tea mug spilled, a pile of community feedback forms scattered across the floor. The security cameras showed Veronica entering and leaving, alone. Asterisk, Margaret didn't call the police. Instead, she wrote Veronica a letter. It read, "Dear Veronica, asterisk, I understand that this time has been difficult for you. Change is rarely easy, especially when it arrives uninvited. I want you to know that I don't hold anger toward you, not for your words, your actions, or even last night, but I do need to ask you to respect this space. Not for me, but for the people who now rely on it. Asterisk, there is dignity in beginning again. I've lived it. If you are willing, I can connect you to housing services, support groups, and even part-time work opportunities. But you have to take the first step. Otherwise, I will have no choice but to proceed with the final notice of removal. Asterisk, this is not about revenge, Veronica. This is about responsibility. Something I think you once knew well. Asterisk yours, sincerely, Margaret. She slid the letter under Veronica's door and waited. Days passed with no reply. Then, on the morning of the 57th day, Margaret received an envelope in her office. Inside was a key. No note, no return address. Just the key to the penthouse. Asterisk Margaret went upstairs herself, accompanied by Isla and the head of security. The penthouse was empty. Immaculately so. Veronica had left quietly in the night, leaving no forwarding address, no contact information, just the echoes of her past self and the silence of a life abruptly exited. Margaret walked through the space slowly, remembering the first time she had seen it back when it was an untouchable world above her head. Now, it felt like just another room. Lavish, yes, but lifeless. Asterisk, she stood by the balcony, looking out over the city, and whispered, "Goodbye, Veronica." Asterisk, there was no triumph in her voice, only closure. Asterisk, with the penthouse vacated, Margaret didn't rush to rent it. Instead, she proposed something radical, turning the space into a shared wellness and creative arts center for the building, a place for yoga classes, art therapy, reading groups, and senior storytelling circles. The idea was met with overwhelming support. Asterisk renovations began the following week. Residents volunteered to help. Teenagers painted murals, older women organized knitting groups, and a former dancer offered to lead gentle movement classes every Thursday. The penthouse, once a symbol of exclusion, became a haven of connection. Asterisk, but even as Margaret was embraced by the community, her personal life remained quietly solitary. Jacob, her son, lived overseas now, busy with his own life. They spoke occasionally, politely, but there was a distance between them that Margaret hadn't yet bridged. He was proud of her accomplishments, of course, but he had always seen her as static, fixed in place. This transformation startled him. Asterisk, Mom, are you sure you're not overdoing it? He had asked during a phone call. Asterisk, she had smiled softly. I spent 40 years underdoing it, sweetheart. Let me try the other side. Asterisk, she didn't blame Jacob. He had his own path, and she had hers. For now, her fulfillment came not from titles or recognition, but from the daily rhythm of change, the joy in watching a mother carry groceries with help, the sound of laughter echoing through what used to be a silent building, the warmth of being greeted by name in the hallway. Asterisk, and yet, she remained grounded. For every kind gesture, she remembered the struggles that had brought her here. She still wore her old coat, still brewed the same tea, still lived in her small house, though the roof no longer leaked, and the garden now overflowed with life. To the outside world, it remained a simple home, but to Margaret, it was sacred. Asterisk. One Sunday morning, she hosted an open breakfast at her cottage for the Ellison Commons staff and volunteers. Folding chairs were placed on the lawn, and bowls of fresh fruit, muffins, and hot coffee sat on wooden tables draped in soft cloths. Isla arrived first, followed by Devon, Kira, Maribel, and a dozen others. Some had never seen where Margaret lived and were surprised by its quaintness. Asterisk, this is where it all began, Kira asked, glancing at the old photos on the wall. Asterisk, Margaret smiled. This is where I remembered who I was. Asterisk, they spent hours sharing stories, memories, and laughter. And as the sun rose higher, Margaret looked around and saw not just a team but a family she had never expected to build at this stage in life. Asterisk, toward the end of the gathering, Isla pulled Margaret aside. You've changed this place. But more than that, you've changed how people think about what's possible at any age. Asterisk, Margaret chuckled. I didn't plan for any of this. I just got tired of being underestimated. Asterisk, Isla smiled. And look where that got you. Asterisk, Margaret looked at the faces around her. Not tenants, not staff, just people, living, learning, growing together. She had bought a building. But more than that, she had rebuilt a world where worth wasn't measured by age, wealth, or status, but by courage, kindness, and quiet resilience. And with every passing day, the legacy she and Charles had dreamed of wasn't just remembered, it was lived. Margaret's transformation of Hartley Heights, now Ellison Commons, had reached a point where the building had become more than just a residential complex. It had become a symbol of second chances, of quiet power, of how one person, even in their late 60s, could reclaim dignity not only for themselves, but for a whole community. Yet, as the building flourished, and the people within it found themselves healing in small, daily ways, Margaret encountered one of her most personal and bittersweet challenges, confronting the ghosts of her own sacrifices. Even as the upper floors buzzed with new life, the wellness center blooming in the former penthouse, tutoring classes echoing from the common rooms, and laughter returning to the courtyard, Margaret remained grounded in routine. She still walked the halls each morning, spoke to the janitor about supplies, reminded the kids to put away their bikes properly, and helped coordinate birthday events for elderly residents. She worked as though the building was an extension of her own body, but beneath the warm smiles and steady leadership, she was carrying something heavy: regret, not of the past exactly, but of the moments that had passed her by. The trigger came one evening as she sat at her kitchen table reading an email from Jacob. It was short, respectful, and distant. "Hey Mom, just a quick update. I'm relocating to Singapore for a new role. It's a 2-year project, and things are moving fast. I'll call when I settle in. Hope you're doing well with everything at the building. It's amazing what you've accomplished. Best, Jacob." There were no questions about her health, no hint of curiosity about her feelings. No trace of the closeness they once shared when he was a child and she was his whole world. The sentence, "It's amazing what you've accomplished," felt more like a compliment to a stranger than to a mother. Margaret stared at the screen for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and sat back, a cold emptiness pressing against her chest. She had built something beautiful out of her pain. She had brought hope to others. But in doing so, had she lost something of her own? Had she poured so much of herself into the lives of strangers that she had forgotten how to keep her own family close? She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the building glowing under soft evening lights. For a moment, she saw her own reflection, older, wiser, yes, but also lonelier. There was a time when Jacob had filled this house with questions, laughter, and ambition. A time when they would sit on this very table and talk about the future, about his dreams, about the world. That future had come, but it had taken him so far from her. Margaret's eyes welled up, not from bitterness, but from quiet grief. The following morning, she found herself distracted. The usual tasks that brought her comfort felt mechanical. She smiled at tenants, took notes during committee meetings, and discussed plans for a fall harvest event in the courtyard. But her mind wandered. When Isla noticed her unusually quiet demeanor, she waited until the day ended before gently pulling her aside. "You okay?" Isla asked, handing her a cup of tea. Margaret hesitated. "I received a message from Jacob. He's moving to Singapore. For 2 years. Isla sat beside her. "Do you want to visit him? Or maybe take some time off? You've been going non-stop since this all began." Margaret shook her head slowly. "It's not that. He has his own life now. I raised him to chase his dreams, and he did. I'm proud of that. But there's a part of me that wonders if I spent so many years trying to give him everything that I forgot how to stay in his life once he had it all." Isla didn't respond right away. Instead, she placed a hand over Margaret's and let the silence speak for them both. Then, gently, she said, "Maybe it's not too late to reconnect. Just because you changed your life doesn't mean you can't re-enter his." Margaret smiled faintly. "Maybe." That evening, she went back to her house and opened an old chest from under her bed. Inside were Jacob's childhood drawings, school reports, letters he had written from summer camps, and the sweater he had worn the day he got accepted to college. She hadn't opened this chest in years. As she carefully looked through each item, she realized something. She had been living through everyone else's second chances, but she hadn't allowed herself one with her own son. She decided to write him a letter, not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten letter, the kind she used to put in his lunchbox when he was little. "Dear Jacob, I read your message. I'm proud of you. I always have been. You've done what your father and I dreamed for you, to go further than we ever could. But I want you to know something. I miss you. I miss us. I miss being part of your world, not just as someone you update, but as someone you still talk to about life, about silly things, about big things. Asterisk, I've changed a lot over the past year. I'm not the same woman who used to stay home and worry over bills. I've built something real, but none of it means anything if I don't have my son to share it with. Asterisk, come visit, let's talk. No pressure, just tea and conversation. Asterisk, with love. Mom, she mailed it the next day. 2 weeks passed with no reply, but in that time, Margaret focused again on her work. She helped launch a program called the Wisdom Circle in the top floor center, where elderly women from the building shared life stories, lessons, and laughs every Sunday evening. It became one of the most popular events in Ellison Commons. Teenagers came to listen, volunteers recorded the stories for archiving, and a local journalist even pitched a podcast idea. Asterisk, one evening, as Margaret was preparing for the Wisdom Circle, Devin came to her office with a puzzled look. Asterisk, there's someone downstairs asking for you, he said. Asterisk, Margaret put down the flower arrangement she was carrying. Who is it? Asterisk, Devin smiled. A guy in a navy coat, carrying a suitcase. Says he's your son. Margaret's heart stopped. She moved quickly through the building, almost afraid to hope. When she reached the lobby, there he was, just taller than she remembered, hair slightly grayer at the temples, but eyes just as familiar. Asterisk, hi Mom, he said, voice uncertain but warm. Asterisk, she walked to him and placed her hands on his face. You came. Asterisk, he nodded. Your letter. It felt like coming home. They hugged for a long time. That night, Jacob stayed at her cottage. They talked into the early morning hours, about the past, about his father, about the building, about everything they had both been holding in silence. Asterisk. Jacob confessed that he had kept his distance because he didn't know how to relate to the new version of her. You were always the one who needed help, he said. Now you're helping everyone else. I didn't know where I fit anymore. Asterisk, you fit wherever you want to, Margaret replied. You're my son. That never changes. They laughed, cried, and reconnected. The next day, Jacob joined her for a tour of Ellison Commons. He met residents, attended a wisdom circle, and even joined the team for lunch. He was stunned by what she had built, not just the structure, but the spirit. Asterisk, I didn't realize how much you've done, he said, and how many people you've touched. Asterisk, you're part of this too, she said. Even if you didn't see it before. Asterisk, before he left, he promised to return in a few months, and this time, not just for a visit but for a longer stay. Asterisk, Margaret stood on her porch that evening, watching him walk toward the taxi, and felt something deep in her chest settle, not closure but continuation. Asterisk, she hadn't just saved a building, she had saved a relationship. Asterisk, she hadn't just found her purpose, she had found her way back to her own heart. Asterisk, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over Ellison Commons, Margaret whispered to herself, This is what healing looks like. Asterisk, she had lived through loneliness, through mockery, through loss, but now she was living through love, and she wasn't done yet. Margaret awoke the next morning with the same peaceful certainty that had settled over her heart the night before. The warmth of reconnecting with Jacob still glowed within her, like the final ember of a long, cold fire now reignited. The weight she had carried quietly for years, regret, longing, and the ache of maternal distance had softened. For the first time in decades, she did not begin the day by bracing herself for loss or loneliness. She woke up simply content, but Margaret was not one to pause for long, even in joy. Contentment, to her, wasn't the absence of effort, it was the strength to continue building while at peace with the past. Asterisk, she got dressed in her favorite olive green cardigan and matching flats and prepared her cottage for visitors. That afternoon, the Ellison Commons board members were due for a quarterly update meeting. These gatherings had become a cornerstone of the community's new governance structure, a sign of Margaret's commitment to transparency and empowerment. She had no interest in being the sole authority in a place that now housed over 120 individuals and families. Leadership, she believed, should be shared, just as success must be. Asterisk, she placed fresh lavender from her garden in a small jar on the table, laid out cookies and tea, and opened her notebook to review the agenda. She smiled at how official everything now looked. From patent sketches to spreadsheets, from widowhood to community building, her life had shifted into something she could never have imagined in, yet it felt perfectly natural. Asterisk, Isla arrived, first, as she often did, carrying a manila folder filled with financial summaries and renovation updates. Following her were Devon, representing the Tenants' Council, Ruth, a retired librarian who oversaw the building's literacy programs, and Jerome, a single father who managed the night's security shift and acted as the informal voice for working-class residents. They greeted each other like old friends, not colleagues, sharing jokes, personal updates, and laughter before getting down to business. They covered a wide range of topics. The new solar panels on the south side had reduced communal energy bills by 14%. The after-school tutoring sessions now had more children enrolled than available volunteer tutors. The Elderly Support Initiative, which Margaret had titled Golden Threads, was offering companionship visits, wellness checks, and light housework to residents over 60-5. And then came the big item. The city council had invited Margaret to speak at an upcoming urban development summit. They wanted her to present Ellison Commons as a case study in senior-led revitalization, community-first design, and equitable housing. It was a recognition few buildings, let alone building owners, ever received. Isla looked excited. You'll be speaking alongside the mayor, local legislators, and CEOs of major development firms. This is huge. Devon chuckled. Bet none of them know how to bake muffins and fix a leaky faucet. Margaret smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held something underneath, concern maybe, or weariness. She thanked everyone for their work, reviewed next steps, and adjourned the meeting with warmth as always. But after everyone left, Isla lingered. You're not excited about the summit? She asked gently, picking up the empty cups. It's not that I'm not excited, Margaret said, taking a slow sip of tea. It's that I'm careful. Careful of what? Of becoming someone I no longer recognize. Isla tilted her head. You mean, recognition changing you? Margaret nodded. This started as a response to a personal wound, a way to reclaim my dignity, to honor my husband, to help people who, like me, had been overlooked. But now, as it grows, I wonder if it might outgrow what made it honest. Isla sat down beside her. It's not your responsibility to shrink so that the mission stays small. Growth doesn't mean losing your essence, it just means sharing it further. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she said, do you think Charles would have understood all this? Isla smiled. I think Charles would have been the one handing out pamphlets and reminding people to recycle. They laughed together, the way friends do when the laughter isn't just about a joke but about shared hope. Later that week, Margaret began preparing for the summit. She crafted her speech slowly, one paragraph at a time, between phone calls and site walks. She didn't hire a publicist or ask for PR advice. Instead, she told stories of Veronica's mockery, yes, but also of the child who had learned to read in the building's library, the widowed war veteran who now led weekly art sessions, the single mother who'd found security in sisterhood after years of living in shelters. On the day of the summit, she wore a deep navy dress and the silver brooch Charles had given her for their 20th anniversary. Isla drove them to the city auditorium. The venue was sleek, modern, towering, a place where power gathered not out of necessity, but out of strategy. Backstage, Margaret paced slowly, reviewing her cue cards. Other speakers gave their remarks filled with numbers, projections, and buzzwords. She listened politely, nodding at economic analyses and urban development graphs. But when her name was called and she stepped onto the stage under a spotlight, everything else faded. She began softly. I am not a developer. I don't hold a business degree. I've never worn a hard hat, and until recently, I didn't know what an RFP was. Laughter. I'm a 67-year-old widow who lived in a house some people laughed at, and one day, I decided not to accept that story anymore. She spoke of Hartley Heights, the cruelty she had endured, the tenants she now called family, of how change didn't start with funding, or FMIT started with listening, with daring to believe that age was not a ceiling, but a foundation. By the time she finished, the entire room was on its feet, not out of politeness, but out of sheer awe. Backstage, Isla hugged her tightly. You've just changed the way this city looks at its elders. Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. Then maybe they'll stop calling us elderly and start calling us necessary. Over the following weeks, the impact of the summit rippled outward. Requests for interviews, community partnerships, and mentorships poured in. Margaret could have chosen to expand rapidly, open other buildings, franchised the idea, but she declined most offers. She believed in scale only if it served people, not egos. Instead, she chose to deepen her roots. She expanded the Learning Center, started an elder teen mentorship program, and even established a fund called the Ellison Seed Fund to support women over 60 launching social enterprises. And then came a surprise. One afternoon, as she sorted mail in the office, she found a small white envelope addressed to her in Veronica's handwriting. Inside was a letter. Dear Margaret, I've been watching from afar. I imagine you're surprised to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what you did and what I didn't do. I've been living in a modest community facility in the Northern District. At first I hated it, but now I'm learning to live differently. Humbly, I've started attending group therapy. They ask us to name someone we wronged. Your name came up more than once. So here's what I can offer. An apology. Sincere, if late. You didn't just buy a building, you rebuilt a soul. I envy that. Veronica Margaret sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. She felt no triumph, no vindication, just grace. The kind of quiet grace that comes when even your enemies begin to heal in your shadow. She replied the next day, Dear Veronica, thank you. That's all I need to say, and all I need to hear. Margaret, that evening, she returned to her cottage, pulled open the curtain, and watched as dusk descended softly over Ellison Commons. Children were drawing chalk on the sidewalk. An elderly couple was walking hand in hand. Somewhere inside, a violin was playing. And Margaret, seated with a cup of tea and a blanket draped over her legs, felt something, rare, perfect moment. Not just of peace, but of meaning. She had been mocked. She had been alone. She had been overlooked. But now, she was remembered. Not for being loud, rich, or young, but for being steady, kind, and brave. She had proven that you don't need a skyscraper to cast a long shadow. Sometimes, all you need is a small house, a fierce heart, and the courage to stand when the world expects you to bow. The transformation of Ellison Commons, once mocked as Hartley Heights, was now complete, not just in structure, but in spirit. Each hallway now carried the soft energy of possibility. Every apartment bore silent witness to resilience, some through children's laughter, others through the sound of a lonely kettle now shared in companionship. There was no plaque outside that read miracle, no banner proclaiming redemption, but it was there in the blooming flowers by the entrance, in the smiles exchanged in elevators, in the soft way people now greeted Margaret like family, not a figurehead. Margaret had lived through humiliation and risen not by crushing those who mocked her, but by quietly outliving their cruelty with grace, action, and service. As the building grew into its new life, so did the people within it. And now, in the 8th chapter of this remarkable journey, Margaret began the most important phase of all, giving it away. Not literally Ellison Commons remained under her stewardship, but in essence, she was slowly turning the leadership over to the community. Her vision was never to be a monarch seated above grateful tenants. She wanted to plant seeds of ownership in the hearts of those who had once only known survival. True empowerment, she believed, came not when people received help, but when they realized they could offer it to others. And so, she created the Commons Leadership Fellowship. It wasn't flashy. It didn't involve applications or interviews. Instead, Margaret and Isla invited residents from every floor to sit in what they called story circles, where people shared their life struggles, wins, skills, and fears. From those circles emerged mentors, innovators, and leaders who had never worn the title but had always carried its weight. Kira, the teenager who had once described the building as a prison, now ran the youth mentorship program. Jerome, the single father and night watchman, was appointed to chair the tenant budgeting committee. Mrs. Phelps, the retired math teacher, began offering financial literacy classes every Thursday. Each of them had been overlooked once. Now, they were pillars. The mural on the back courtyard wall had also changed. What once depicted abstract color now showed a timeline painted by local artists and residents. On one side, the first brushstroke showed a small house under a thundercloud, labeled Margaret's Cottage. As the mural progressed, the colors brightened. There were sketches of residents helping one another, of children reading, of elders dancing, and at the end, there was a small golden tree labeled Roots of Change. Asterisk, the community center in the penthouse, once a symbol of exclusion, had become the heartbeat of the building. Yoga mats now covered the floor during morning wellness sessions. Folding chairs appeared in rows during storytelling circles. One corner held a lending library. Another featured artwork from residents, ranging from toddlers' stick figures to detailed oil portraits painted by a once depressed veteran rediscovering joy through color. Asterisk, one Saturday afternoon, the center hosted its first ever intergenerational talent showcase. Margaret sat in the front row, flanked by Isla and Jacob, who had returned again, this time not for a visit, but for an extended stay while he worked remotely. The evening unfolded with music, laughter, and the kind of vulnerable creativity that can only exist in safe spaces. Asterisk, a young girl recited a poem about her mother's sacrifices. An elderly man played a harmonica tune so beautiful it brought tears. Then, a surprise act. Veronica. Yes, Veronica. She had returned that week, quietly and humbly, requesting to visit. She no longer carried the air of superiority that once defined her. Her clothes were simpler, her makeup lighter, and her voice softer. She stood nervously behind the microphone with a tremble in her hand. Asterisk, I don't deserve to be here, she began, but I hope you'll let me earn my place back. Asterisk, and then she began to read from her journal entries, written during her time in the shelter, reflections on pride, privilege, and loss. She spoke of the silence that followed her fall, and how, for the first time in her life, she had listened. When she finished, the room was quiet, not out of judgment, but out of awe. Asterisk, Margaret stood and walked to her. Without a word, she took Veronica's hand and guided her off the stage. The applause came not in a roar, but in waves, gentle, respectful, human. Asterisk, after the event, as the chairs were being folded away and cookies passed around, Veronica sat with Margaret on the rooftop balcony. Asterisk, you saved more than this building, she said, looking out at the city lights. You saved me from myself. Asterisk, Margaret nodded slowly. You did that part. Asterisk, they sat in silence for a long time, the distance between past and present slowly folding into peace. Asterisk, that night, Margaret lay in bed and thought about legacy. Asterisk, for years, she had believed legacy was something left behind after death, after departure, after the end. But now she realized something deeper. Legacy wasn't what you left, it was what you lived. It was in the habits you modeled, the people you lifted, the systems you changed without demanding praise. It was in the way you turned pain into progress, without ever letting bitterness stain your soul. Asterisk, she also thought about Charles. She hadn't dreamed of him in weeks, but that night, he came vivid and real. They were sitting at the old kitchen table again. He was holding the same blueprints she had pulled from the box that started it all, but this time, he slid them back across the table. You finished what I started, he said. No, she replied. We finished it together. He smiled, then faded. When Margaret woke, she wept quietly, not from grief, but from gratitude. Asterisk, she knew now that she didn't need to own buildings or lead programs to continue building. Her role was changing. She was becoming more of a guide, a whisper instead of a command. And that was a beautiful evolution. Asterisk. Isla encouraged her to write a book, and so Margaret began compiling her reflections. Not a memoir, she insisted. Something honest, she said, a record for the forgotten, a guide for the overlooked. She titled it The Small House Revolution. Each chapter focused not on strategy, but on spirit, not on statistics, but on souls. She included stories of failure, fear, and embarrassment, but she also celebrated joy, the joy of reclaiming voice, space, and self-worth. Asterisk, as the book began circulating in activist circles, senior centers, and community organizations, letters started arriving at Ellison Commons from around the country. Widows, divorced mothers, grandfathers raising grandchildren, people on fixed incomes, people living in trailers, studio apartments, or in their cars. They wrote things like, your story reminded me I'm not too late. Asterisk, I thought I was useless until I saw what you built. Asterisk, I used to hide. Now I speak. Asterisk, Margaret read every letter. She replied to many. Some she pinned to a corkboard in her office labeled Voices That Matter, and then came a call that surprised her more than any other. It was from a documentary filmmaker named Ava Milton. She wanted to make a feature-length film about Ellison Commons, one that centered not on the sensationalism of revenge, but on the deep humanity of recovery, responsibility, and hope. Margaret agreed in one condition: no actors, she said, no voiceovers, just truth, just us. And so the film crew arrived, quiet, respectful, shadowing daily life. They captured a tenant learning to read, a single dad finding a job through the resource room, Veronica helping with event planning, Isla mentoring teen girls, and Margaret, every morning, sweeping the sidewalk in front of the building, humming softly. The film premiered at a small local theater, followed by a standing ovation. But Margaret didn't attend the red carpet. She watched it from the Commons room with the tenants eating popcorn, holding hands, and wiping tears. As the final scene faded, Margaret seated on her porch, a cup of tea in hand, watching kids play in the courtyard. A quote appeared on screen. They laughed at my small house. Now, they live in the home we built together. The credits rolled to the sound of laughter, real, joyful, free, and in that moment, Margaret knew she hadn't just survived ridicule. She hadn't just purchased the building that once symbolized her humiliation. She hadn't even just restored it. She had transformed it into something alive, something generational, something sacred. And with that, her journey came full circle. But she wasn't done yet, because true homes are never finished. They just keep growing. Room by room, heart by heart, person by person. The morning air carried the gentle scent of honeysuckle, drifting in through the open window of Margaret's small cottage. It was a scent she'd grown up with, something that reminded her of summer afternoons and childhood simplicity. This particular morning, it felt especially significant, almost ceremonial, because today wasn't just another day at Ellison Commons. It was a day of farewell, not goodbye in the final sense, but in the sense that seasons shift, that chapters turn, that a story pauses so another can begin. Margaret, now 68, stood in front of the mirror, fastening the same pearl necklace she had worn at her wedding, at Jacob's college graduation, and most recently, at the unveiling of the Ellison Commons mural. Each time, it had symbolized something important: commitment, pride, transformation. Today, it was for closure, not the kind tied to endings, but the kind that says, I have done what I came to do. The past few months had unfolded with a kind of elegant inevitability. Her story had traveled far through the book The Small House Revolution, through the documentary that brought tears to the eyes of strangers, through community newsletters, and even through social media, where clips of her speeches and interviews circulated like warm lanterns in a dark digital sky. She had received invitations from international conferences, offers from real estate developers, even a letter from a senator. But through it all, she had remained rooted in the truth that started everything. This wasn't about her. It was never about Margaret becoming famous or wealthy or powerful. It was about dignity, about the quiet courage to reclaim it, about offering that same courage to others. And now, having built a thriving, self-sustaining community, Margaret was ready to pass the torch, not because she was tired, but because she believed in the next generation. She stepped into the morning light, carrying a small leather-bound journal. It wasn't for her. It was for Kira, the young girl who once called the building a prison and now stood as one of its strongest voices. Margaret had seen herself in Kira: the defiance, the doubt, the need for something to prove. Over time, Kira had become more than a mentee. She had become a builder in her own right. Margaret entered the community center, now named the Legacy Hall. The name hadn't been her idea. It had been voted on unanimously by the residents. It's not just for you, Jerome had said. It's for the legacy you've helped all of us find. The room was filled with people, residents, staff, friends, volunteers, even city officials who had witnessed the transformation from afar. Margaret had insisted there be no grand speeches, no plaques, no fireworks, just stories. People took turns sharing memories, some funny, some tearful. Devon recalled the first day Margaret walked into the building, wearing a cardigan and holding a clipboard, and how he had thought she was just another kind old woman with a list of complaints. Didn't know she was about to buy the place and turn it into heaven, he said, earning a round of laughter. Asterisk Mrs. Phelps spoke of how she'd been ready to give up on life after her husband passed, but Margaret invited her to teach math to children, and that had given her purpose again. Maribel told the story of how she was offered eviction, and found instead a second chance and a community of sisters. Asterisk and then Kira stood. Asterisk she held up the journal Margaret had handed her moments before. This is filled with stories, she said, but the real story is still being written. And now, Margaret is letting us write the next chapter. Asterisk she looked directly at Margaret. We won't let you down. Asterisk Margaret, seated quietly near the front, smiled through tears. I never thought you would. Asterisk after the gathering, as the crowd lingered over refreshments and music, Margaret stepped out onto the rooftop alone. The city sprawled out before her, not as something to conquer, but as something to coexist with. The noise, the steel, the motion, it all hummed in the distance. But here, at Ellison Commons, there was a different kind of rhythm, slower, kinder, real. Asterisk she thought of Charles, of the dreams he never lived to see, of the nights he sketched ideas at the kitchen table while Jacob slept, and she dozed with a book on her lap. He would have loved this view, not just for the skyline, but for what it stood for. A woman, looking out over something beautiful she helped build with her own hands. Asterisk hey, came a voice behind her. Asterisk she turned. It was Jacob. Asterisk he had flown in again, surprising her for the farewell gathering. He stood now with a cup of tea in one hand and an envelope in the other. Asterisk, what's that? She asked. He handed it to her. Something from me. And from the people who couldn't be here today. Asterisk inside was a letter signed by over 3 dozen former residents who had once lived at Hartley Heights and returned years later to see what it had become. Some had moved out because of work, marriage, or other life shifts, but all of them wrote the same thing. You changed what home means. Asterisk one note read, I used to dread coming home. Now, I try to recreate Ellison Commons wherever I live. Asterisk Margaret pressed the letter to her heart. Thank you, she whispered. Asterisk Jacob looked at her with admiration. I spent a long time thinking you were just stuck, that you were too modest, too quiet, too content. I was wrong. You were preparing, you were becoming, and I didn't see it until the whole world did. Asterisk she smiled softly. Sometimes, becoming takes longer when you're busy surviving. Asterisk he reached for her hand. So what now? Asterisk she looked out at the horizon. Now, I let them lead. I rest a little more, and maybe, I build again, smaller, slower, but still building. Asterisk later that evening, back at her cottage, she changed into her old robe, made tea, and lit the candle on her windowsill, the one she always lit for Charles. She didn't cry. She didn't feel lost. She felt full. Asterisk she walked out into her backyard, where the stars were starting to peek through the twilight. She remembered being called the woman in the shoebox house. The one pitied, ignored, or ridiculed. She remembered Veronica's laughter, sharp and dismissive. She remembered the silence of empty nights, the ache of watching Jacob grow distant, the years of stretching every dollar, hiding every bruise of worry, burying every dream beneath duty, and yet, here she was, standing, not broken, but rebuilt. Asterisk her home had never been small. It had always been the right size for what she was meant to become. Asterisk, as the wind rustled through the trees, she whispered into the night, you laughed at my small house. Now I own your apartment complex. But more than that, now I own peace. She went inside, turned down the lights, and sat at the window. Across the street, lights flickered on in Ellison Commons. A couple danced in their living room. Children chased each other in the courtyard. Kira was leading a discussion under the mural. Veronica walked by with a tray of donated books. Everything was still. Everything was alive. Asterisk and Margaret, once mocked, once dismissed, once invisible, sat, wrapped in the quiet victory of a life that had come full circle. She had rewritten her story, and in doing so, she had given hundreds of others the courage to begin writing theirs. Asterisk the final lines of her journey, if they were to be written now, would not be bold or loud. They would be gentle, like her hands, like her voice, like the steady flame of her spirit. She had been underestimated. She had been overlooked. Asterisk she had been doubted. Asterisk but now, she was remembered. Asterisk not for the size of her house but for the size of her heart. Asterisk